In this morning's gospel, Jesus continues preaching his Sermon on the Mount. In these very early days of his ministry, Jesus has quickly amassed a very large following in the region of Galilee. Because of these great crowds, Jesus goes with his 4 newly chosen disciples, Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, James and his brother John, all fishermen. And on this mountain, overlooking possibly the Sea of Galilee, Jesus is better able to teach them, to speak to all of them at once and more easily. It is to this great crowd of followers that Jesus preached the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Today, Jesus turns to us and continues to talk to us directly. You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world. As many of you know, I was born in Hong Kong, and I grew up in this little neighborhood of Guintong. The name is pretty interesting. Originally, the Chinese characters meant official or governmental pond. Nowadays, the name has been changed slightly because of these imperial connotations, and this neighborhood has more of a reputation of being the poorest neighborhood in Hong Kong, of being a place where triads like to recruit. But back in the day, during the early Song dynasty of China, so maybe 1,000 years ago, give or take, salt production was a really, really big deal. Other than land taxes, salt and taxing the production and sale of salt was the main source of revenue for the imperial government. And the salty margins of the Pearl River Delta, where modern-day Hong Kong sits exactly, was the perfect place for one of South China's largest salt beds of its time. Where the Pearl River meets the South China Sea is historically a place that is neither land nor water, not really. The marshes shift depending on the tides of the ocean and the floods of the river. The local peoples saw themselves as different from one another. Land-owning farmers on one side were different from those who made their living on the water. Fishermen who worked on the margins, planting oysters on the shoreline, creating lime from old shells, harvesting all sorts of seafood. All of this industry needed huge amounts of salt to preserve the fish and other seafood so that it could be transported to markets all across southern China and Southeast Asia without spoiling. So producing the sea salt was a really, really big deal. Brackish water had to be gathered and then moved through a series of ponds where the salt would gradually crystallize in the sun and then harvested. My neighborhood was named after this massive system of salt ponds with imperial oversight. Other parts of Hong Kong still bear the mark of this history also. The salty fields of nearby Lam Tin and the little salt pan island of Yim Tin Zai. So in this morning's gospel, when Jesus tells us that you are the salt of the earth, I hear layers and layers of history in his words. I think of the ponds where salt gets harvested and piled up in little pyramids off the shores of the South China Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, also of historic Palestine and Israel. I think of the volume of salt that needs to be used to preserve food for future use in warm and humid climates in a time without refrigeration. When Jesus turns to us and tells us that we are salt, he is asking us to follow his example, not to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. Because not one iota, not one stroke of a single letter will pass from the law or the prophets until all is accomplished, until heaven and earth themselves pass away on the last day. In the confusion and the heartache and the anger that so many of us carry in these times, Jesus asks that we pursue righteousness. For even the least of these commandments point us towards the kingdom of heaven. The metaphor of salt is maybe extra helpful here because salt has many jobs. Salt is a preservative, but it works as a preservative by inhibiting the growth of harmful bacteria, which prevents then decay and rot. But it also, salt, creates an environment that allows beneficial bacteria to ferment the food. Salt is a preservative. So when we are called to be salt, we have to ask ourselves, what are we called to preserve? And what are we called to ferment or to transform? For many of us, this maybe requires reading of Scripture in a different way than we may have been taught, about the difference or the dichotomy between the law and the gospel. But the community of Matthew here today seems to be reading their scriptures, the law and the prophets, in a way that was entirely coherent with their Judaism. This early Christian community understood the Jewish scriptures as still entirely relevant to their context. So when we turn to the prophet Isaiah this morning, we see glimpses of the same wrestling hundreds of years prior, but still speaking to the people today. People who had been exiled from the southern kingdom of Judah had been repatriated, returned to their ancestral home from Babylonian captivity. Returning to Jerusalem, their first priority was to rebuild the temple, which had been destroyed 50 years before. In exile, the people had wrestled with why God would allow such a thing, their destruction and their suffering. In exile, they longed for and hoped for their return home. And yet their return was not as they expected or planned. In today's reading, we hear glimpses through the text that something was not quite right. Yet day after day, they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. The returned exiles have returned to their worship of God, perhaps in the restored temple, or perhaps continuing in practices they learned from their parents or grandparents in Babylonia in the absence of the temple. Daily, they are seeking God. They are eager to learn God's ways, and they are asking God for the right way, eager for the nearness, for the presence of God. And yet, they ask, why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? There is a gap between what they are seeking and what they are experiencing. They are seeking after God's righteous ways, and yet as they practice them, like the sands of the Pearl River Delta, the waters move further and further away from them with every attempt, with each prayer, perhaps with each church service or each hymn we try to sing. For Isaiah, the question is, what are we fasting for? What is the fast which God chooses, which God desires for us? Not to humble ourselves while others go hungry and oppression continues, but rather, is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? when you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn. Then shall we be the light of the world. This is a prophet that Jesus certainly does not come to abolish. This concern for the oppressed and the hungry and the homeless, the poor and the naked, runs through the prophetic tradition. Certainly, we hear so many resonances with Jesus' own words on the mount, on the plain, to us today. We are called to be the fulfillment of this prophecy. For our own contexts, we are called to do these things and to teach others to do these things, not as a way to humble ourselves, but as a way to lift up the lowly, as a way to rebuild ancient ruins and the foundations for future generations. We are called to be the repairer of the breach and the restorer of streets where we can live safely without fear of being profiled or kidnapped, assaulted, or murdered. And yet, I also hear a caution, a warning here in both the Old and New Testament readings this morning. For Isaiah, the temple had been rebuilt, and yet was not what the returnees had thought it would be. In this time, they struggled in their relationship with the people around them who had not been taken away by empire. Isaiah does understand them as part of the new project, the temple as a house of prayer for all people. Yet other prophets during this time cast them as foreigners who will have no part in the temple project. The restoration of temple worship was important, was vital for the people's identity and religious practice. And by the time the New Testament is written and being gathered up together, the Second Temple no longer stands, destroyed by yet another empire. The ancient ruins which were rebuilt and the foundations which stood indeed for many generations are not forever. And both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism develop and they change and maybe even ferment into religions without the temple at their center. Religions where God is present, where the law and the prophets do not pass away, but they have to be practiced in a new way and in a new context. Jesus' words for us too, I can't help but hear this morning through centuries of American history. Just as we are not called to rebuild the temple anew, Jesus' description of a city built on a hill that cannot be hid, I also cannot take as a new commandment. Those words have taken a life of its own. The early colonies of New England, of Massachusetts, and Boston, and later the entirety of these United States, as the city upon a hill, a social and a political project built on top of the indigenous peoples of this land, with the labor and exploitation of Black people trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean. This ideology, this idolatry of the city upon a hill has been used to exclude every generation of immigrants to this country. The Catholic immigrants, first from Ireland, Italy, and Germany, to exclude Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, to deny constitutional rights to the people of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, places which our government has purchased and continues to colonize. This city, on a hill, has been built with walls. And walls are always used to keep a population of people inside of its walls, safe from everyone and everything outside. These are the walls which have been destroyed in our historical and our biblical record. So what will we choose to rebuild today? What will be the foundation for our future generations? And what will be repaired and restored with our salt and our light. The great irony of our Christian faith is that this brokenness, our human brokenness, is where God's good news is found. Jesus has harsh words for salt which has lost its taste. It becomes useless, good for nothing, and so it can only be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And yet, each of us this morning arrived safely to church only because salt was thrown out onto the roads and sidewalks. Our steps found safe purchase only because of the salt underneath our feet, which melts dangerous patches of ice. And I can see in my mind's eye the salt of the sea being transformed into salt of the earth panned up from the ponds. Light, too, is scattered. It flickers in the darkness. It often requires our neighbors to relight when they are extinguished, like candles at our Christmas Eve service or our Easter vigil. All of us, salty and full of fear and expectation, hold on to flickering candles, wondering at God's presence, yearning to hear God's answer to our prayers. But God's answer always is in God's own presence inside that breach. As we turn to the altar this morning, we will celebrate together the sacred meal of Holy Communion, where God is offered to us in the brokenness and in the fractured pieces of Christ's own body. Whatever strength we need to go on, this is the food for the hungry. Let us come to God's table, then, to learn what it is to have our own brokenness transformed on this altar, to meet the source of all light and all life, the source of our saltiness and the warmth of our candles. As we gather together, may we learn what stays when we ask for our ways to be changed into God's ways. And when we are scattered once again at the end of the service, as the broken pieces of Christ's body and Christ's blood, may we go out into this world as God's salt of the world, God's salt of the earth, and as God's light of the world. May we preserve what needs to be preserved, ferment and change what needs to be changed. May we all be witnesses to God's goodness, God's life, amidst the brokenness of this world. Amen.